Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm honoured to be speaking with psychologist Professor Stephen Rollnick. Steve, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's genuinely a pleasure to be with you.
Well, it's an absolute honour to be speaking with you, Steve, because I've been a long-term admirer of your work and the framework you've created for psychologists, and clearly not just for sports psychologists, but for clinical psychs and counselling psychs, organisational psychs. So I'm really, really excited to have this conversation today. And this is going to be a two-parter. This is going to be a two-part podcast because you've co-written a book called Coaching Athletes to Be Their Best, Motivational Interviewing in Sports. Motivational interviewing is the framework that you've devised and developed over the last 30 odd years. And next week, I'm going to be joined by one of your co-authors, performance psychologist Dr. Jonathan Fader. So that's going to be really, really exciting, and we're going to really hone in on the sports psychological aspect of motivational interviewing. And look, we'll do that today, but I do want to begin at the beginning. Because I'm excited to have pinned you down, and I want to start by, let's start by getting you to introduce yourself to the audience, the Sports Psych Show audience, and then we'll start talking about motivational interviewing and how it came to be what it is today. So, Steve, tell the audience about yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Dan. Look, I had an aspiration to be a counselor as a young man in my 20s because I guess I wanted to learn how to help people to thrive and change. So if you like, that's the starting point. Cape Town, South Africa, which is where I grew up. Sport-loving nutcase from Newlands, Cape Town. And I had this kind of parallel life for the past 20, 30 years. One of them in helping people to change and difficult conversations on the one hand, and the other as largely a spectator and to some extent a participant in sport on the other. And these two worlds have only fairly recently come together with ease. I found the crossover a really enjoyable journey. But where it started for me was in very difficult conversations about change with people. That's where it started. I was a nurse, then I became a psychologist. Difficult conversations about change. In this case, it was in addiction treatment, which might seem some distance from sport. But what I noticed was that the staff around me, and includes myself, we had a fairly clear sense of what was good for other people, in this case, alcoholics and drug addicts. And our task was to insert the wisdom, knowledge, and motivation to change into them. Okay. And what happened in those experiences I had in my early days informed the development of motivational interviewing. And if I could put it bluntly, Dan, it felt like the more we tried to insert motivation into someone else, the more likely they were to resist. And this was a very disturbing experience because there were high stakes involved, and I saw clients walk out of groups. One of them shot himself. I've seen some violent stuff, okay? And I was very disturbed about this and came across a paper written by somebody called William Miller, who was really the originator of motivational interviewing. And over a period of 30 plus years, we asked ourselves this question. Does improving the relationship allow us to get to the point of calmness in a conversation with somebody so that they, rather than us, provide the wisdom, the knowledge, and the motivation for why and how they might change? So, if you like, that's 30 years in one sentence. And what we did was in exploring the answer to that question about relationship building, we developed something called motivational interviewing and studied it. And we did this by working from the bottom up. We had and still have no theory about why it works, but for us the guiding force was the reaction of the person we were speaking to. So in a sense, our clients were our coaches. And what we discovered was that if we could improve our connecting skills, and you and I no doubt will return to what we mean by connecting and how you do that, but if we improve our connecting skills with people, it is possible to use techniques derived from psychotherapy, which I'm going to say later are in us. Naturally, we have that inside all of us, but we drew them from psychotherapy. It is then possible to use these techniques to draw out or elicit people's own good ideas about why and how they might change, supported by our expertise, but not dominated by it. Offered to them, not imposed on them. So that's it in like a couple of sentences, Dan, and I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with jargon there. I kind of, if you like, I've got this image of like a sailboat in my mind. If you imagine the person you're speaking to, whether it's an athlete, a client, a patient, or an offender, whomever, you're sitting in the sailboat with them and they've got the rudder. But if necessary, you might take over the rudder as their guide to steer them in a direction that you feel is in their best interest. So it's a gentle process of handing over control in a conversation to someone else so that they can steer their own path.
So as a psychologist,
yeah,
you were confronted with alcoholics, people who had severe addictions, mental health problems, challenges, disorders, welfare and well-being challenges, and you found that by taking a directive approach, an instructional approach, well, essentially the directive and the instructional, the do what I say, was very, very limited. And so, along with a colleague, you devised something called motivational interviewing, and it's, in essence, at the core of that, it's a framework to help people to help themselves. It's a framework to help people to help themselves. And in essence, what you're saying is that as a psychologist, and we can replace the word psychologist for coach, or with coach, as a psychologist or coach, you're a guide rather than an expert as such. And you can, it's a co-creation or a two-way interaction where you can help guide the person in front of you, the client if you like, the player if you like, to get to where they want to go by a series, by this, using this framework with a series of tools and linguistic tools, essentially.
Brilliant. You nailed it, man. Yeah. No, that's a lovely. I think you've captured it there, and you know, then on the journey in developing this, we started looking at its integration and relevance in a wide range of areas. Okay. And I spent a good 20 years in and around health and social care, where there was a very strong focus on behavior change. But at the same time, I noticed that the practitioners who were trying to use motivational interviewing were very much affected by the culture around them. And if I could put it bluntly, where the culture was conducive to using motivational interviewing, the whole atmosphere in the service seemed to change and people seemed to thrive. So that it's clear to me now, looking back, that there are connections between the way individual conversations are handled and the wider culture in which a group of athletes or players sit. And that the connection is the use of respectful relationship building among everyone involved. And so this has opened up for me a very exciting terrain, some of which I've tried to capture in that book, which covers how teamwork can be improved and how a group, how you speak to a group. And there is a literature on the subject of motivational interviewing in groups. And I've got some personal experience of this. How do you speak to a group so you get the best out of them? How do you develop players so they are able to listen to each other, empathize with each other, make solid decisions together? So that's taking this conversation off in the direction of groups and teamwork. But yes, I think you cracked the essence. And one other, if you like, discovery was that, and I sort of came around a full circle back to where I started as a young nurse, and realized that giving advice is a very skillful activity, which can be compatible with motivational interviewing. So I don't want you and I to fall into the trap of thinking that there are kind of two styles for being with athletes and players. One of them is directive and instructional. The other is like motivational interviewing. In truth, it is possible to give people advice in a very effective way if the connection is solid and you use conversation skills well. And in the research side of things, what we've done is define exactly what those skills are. So we're capable of defining what motivational interviewing is, along with the conversational skills that you would use to get the best out of the situation.
So as you're speaking there, I'm kind of reappraising what I said before, because I think what I said, or part of what I said, was quite binary. As you noted there, it was directive versus non-directive. And what I hear you say there is actually what these skills, which we'll go on to talk about, these motivational interviewing techniques and skills, can actually help improve your capacity as a coach to advise and instruct. It can lay down a foundation for connection that actually enhances and builds the efficacy of the kind of instructions you may want to provide for a player. In fact, it gives you a better opportunity to advise a player.
Got it. Yeah, that's right. One of the useful models, if you like, conceptual models that I came up with 20 years ago, and it wasn't original anyway, was simply to use three words on a continuum. On the one end was direct and instruct or instruct. At the other end was follow or listen, and in the middle was guide. Okay? And what I found useful about that was that I realized that motivational interviewing sits in the center of that continuum, and indeed exists in the skillfulness that I've observed in teachers and coaches, and sometimes myself as a parent. I do best as a parent if I'm guiding rather than just instructing all the time, and I do better as a guide as a parent than simply to follow a kid and let the kid make up their minds for themselves about everything. So there's this kind of middle ground, this middle space in which you can take the best of both styles either side, whether it's spending a bit of time following or spending a bit of time instructing. If you're sitting in the middle space with a set of core values that drive what you do, and we might want to unpack what those core values are. But, I think motivational interviewing is governed or driven by a set of values which I've noticed many sports coaches and psychologists share.
before we unpack some of the
Yeah.
techniques,
Yeah.
I just briefly want to keep dwelling on the past a little bit. You actually open the book with a great quote from Blaise Pascal. You take us back to the 17th century.
Yeah.
And Pascal said, people are better persuaded by the reasons which they have themselves discovered than by those that come into the mind of others.
Yeah.
Just with that in mind, your own
Yeah.
experience of going on this journey, was this a sudden epiphany? Did it take a number of years? Because you said when I was a nurse, I was very much into, we had models that were very much a tell, and obviously we've talked about it's not binary, but I would imagine at that time you went immediately to this is what you should do, this is how
Correct.
I think you should go about it. Did that epiphany happen over time? Was it an immediate thing? What was your transformation like?
It was incredibly interesting because I grew up with this kind of idea of wanting to help people, and I'm a very practical guy. So it seemed perfectly reasonable when I went into counseling to begin with to give people advice and to focus on what they should do. And I guess the epiphany, it was gradual, but it was certainly provoked by some literally traumatic experiences of violence with clients, not between me and them, but violent things that happened. This realization that as counselors, and I don't think we need to look too far into sport to see the parallels, we were very focused on the what and the how of change, but not the why. And that was an epiphany in a way, because I realized that sitting just beneath the surface of the what and the how is, why do you want to do this? And when it came to things like addiction, or someone who's like me, who's had a heart attack and who maybe needs to change their lifestyle, the why is critically important. And so that is where we got the word motivational interviewing from, that a very powerful driver of behavior change is someone's motivation. And this has been, I've seen evidence for really remarkable transformations in people and clients who are given a comfortable space in a conversation to say why they might change. And the essence of motivational interviewing is, if you can provide that space, and it doesn't have to take a long time, them hearing themselves say how they could change, rather than from you, and we call that change talk, that is a very powerful experience, and it predicts better outcome. And so, without wanting to in any way become puffy-chested or egotistical about research evidence, there are now upward of 1,400 randomized controlled trials of motivational interviewing. And I think they point to this, that if people are given a bit of space to say why they might change, it genuinely predicts better outcome in some quite hard measures to do with physical well-being and indeed even mortality. Okay. So that has been a powerful driver of my writing and my work, and I see it all the time in sport, Dan, the neglect of the conversation about why.
I love that term, the neglect of the conversation, because you said the neglect of the conversation about why. I think if we were to head now towards sport, there's just a neglect of conversation, because we're so socialized into the coach as fixer, and as a consequence, and bearing in mind this binary scenario, what I mean by that is we're so socialized into coach as fixer and an immediate fix. I'm the coach, I have this information, you do this. And as we're alluding to, there is an element of that, and that's fine. However, it's how you set the foundations in place to enable that to happen, and it would be efficacious to have conversations, to start that process of change talk. And so if we head towards sport, I mean, for me, the pain points, Steve, and I know you have a passion for sport, and you've in more recent times got much more involved in the sporting landscape, the sporting world, especially the coaching world. The pain points for coaches are psychosocial elements such as doubt, low motivation, anxiety, self-esteem, low confidence, etc., etc. The psychosocial factors, if you like. And it's really interesting in your book. I mean, I'm being a bit selfish here because I'm on a bit of a mission to help coaches understand that anxiety happens to you, doubt happens to you, low motivation happens to you, low confidence happens to you. These aren't the fault of the player. And again, if we're talking about socialization, in sport we've been quite lazy, in as much as throughout the 80s, 90s and into the noughties we've said, well, coaches should insist on great attitudes, coaches should insist on effort and energy, and it's like, whoa, stop. Insistence prevents change talk. Insistence prevents great conversations. Now, I'm taking you down this path because I love one of the, and look, it's only a subheading, but you've written doubt and low motivation are normal. And are the keys to unlocking change. And that grabbed me because I'm on such a mission to help coaches understand that. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Doubt and low motivation are normal, and actually they're in essence they're exciting to people who are engaging in motivational interviewing.
It is exciting because that doubt and uncertainty provides the fuel and the fire for change. Our shared assumption is probably that doubt and uncertainty is a state of discomfort to some extent. I say it's natural because who doesn't experience it? Okay, quite simply, we use the term ambivalence. That's the sort of fancy psychological term we use, but we've looked into it quite carefully. People feel this, and they are particularly sensitive when they feel this to how they're spoken to, okay? Because it's not a comfortable state to be in, and you can swing either to or away from change in this state. More often than not, when we feel ambivalent, we retreat into a safe place of no change. That is normal. I could shower you with stories about that in my everyday life, okay? It's completely what human beings seem to do. But then we have an interesting puzzle here. If someone is experiencing that, an addiction, that's why motivational interviewing comes from addiction. You cannot find a more dramatic example of this conflict than someone who's in the throes of addiction, because it's their best friend and their worst enemy at the same time. Okay, so that, I guess, is how we discovered this. There's an interesting question about how you speak to somebody who feels this way. And in essence, what we discovered was that if you try and resolve it for them, or let me put it this way, if you take someone who's feeling uncertain about an everyday scenario, let's say, to change jobs, and they're feeling very uncertain about this. If you present the arguments to them for change, it's something in the dynamic of this doubt and uncertainty that it's a natural human reaction for them to give voice to precisely the opposite, because they feel threatened by your arguments, and so to preserve their self-esteem, they're likely to tell you why a change is not a good idea. So this is a rather peculiar quirk, I think, of human nature, and we'll find it in our everyday lives. So if I say to my kid, look, these are the reasons why you need to take a bath now, you're going to get kickback. Okay, and you'll hear the reasons why not. So it's normal. And what we discovered was that if in this sensitive state, you come alongside them and you express empathy with that state. And in a moment, I'm hoping we can talk about what we mean by empathy, because I think it could do with some demystification in sport. If you do that and encourage them to say for themselves why change might be a good idea, this is what Pascal's getting at. Now, I hope I haven't gone on too long in answer to that question, but doubt is normal. In the face of doubt in someone else, connect with them, number one, and give them some space to resolve it.
If we accept that doubt is normal, that anxiety is normal and happens to you, no matter how much skill you have in your hands or your feet as a sports participant, that low confidence can happen to human beings, that low motivation, very much, motivation goes up and down, by and large. There's very few people, I would imagine, who are constant. If we accept this, then it's a coaching challenge to be able to help players manage these things. Now, let's draw upon maybe an example you see in sport, because I'm hearing all that you're saying, and I love what you're saying. And I think in sport, where we've got ourselves to is a very, very black and white scenario. I hear a lot of time from coaches, and I don't blame them, because we've been socialised into this approach for the last 50 years, 100 years, however long. Well, Dan, the players just have to know, and they've just got to do it. They've just got to know it, and they've just got to do it, and that's just the way it is. They've just got to turn up on time, for example, and that's just the way it is. They've just got to turn up on time. And if we were to use that specific example, for instance, as turning up on time, and I know it's something that drives coaches mad when players don't do that, and they will drop and they'll get rid of players as a consequence of that. But if we want to have this change talk, because let's just say, and this is the thing, Steve, is that quite often the players who struggle to turn up on time and sometimes don't are the ones who have an enormous wealth of ability.
Yeah.
An enormous wealth of ability. You've seen it. Yeah. I deal with it every single day.
Yeah.
And what is the definition of coaching? To me, the definition of coaching is helping those players to help themselves, helping those participants. So yes, let's talk about empathy here as a technique or a skill of motivational interviewing. Because let's say we've got a player who doesn't turn up on time, who is late, and the guy or the girl might say, well, coach, I'm sorry, and the coach kind of says, well, yeah, but these are our rules, or yeah, but it's not acceptable. I think what you're about to tell me is actually yes, but isn't the optimal approach here, but empathy is. Which might seem strange, so please enlighten me on that one.
Wow, and this is like a very big subject for me, and quite tough to deal with briefly, but
of course,
perhaps I could say that, first of all, empathy is something you can practice. It's not some magical quality that some people have and some people don't. It's an ability to stand in someone else's shoes, step one. We've all got that. Kids have got it in bucketfuls. They're curious. What's required for empathizing is curiosity. That's the first step. The second step, which is that's like an internal experience. I imagine what your experience is. The second step is to convey this to them, okay, in the form of a statement, not a question. So, if you like, that's the technique, and it can be used in the service of a wide range of coach scenarios, okay? And notice it's not equivalent to a following style where you just let someone talk and talk and talk. It can be used very actively and very purposefully. So in motivational interviewing, in the face of someone who's ambivalent, you would use empathy purposefully to elicit change talk. Okay? Now, somebody who's there's a difference between an individual and a group here. And I can imagine the conversation about turning up on time for practice being had with either. Okay? In both cases, what I imagine you and I would like is for that person to feel comfortable enough in their own skin to be honest. And comfort in their own skin means they can express themselves free of fear. So developing athletes, for me, a lot of that is about developing a culture around them in which they can speak their mind free of fear and judgment from other people, because I've learned from clinical settings that if people are in that state, they're more likely to change, because they spend less energy yes-butting and fighting against things and protecting their self-esteem. So whether it's an individual or a group, the coming late for practice doesn't have to be a long conversation. In motivational interviewing, it would involve, first of all, coming alongside with the person. And empathy is extremely useful. You can raise the subject of coming late for practice, get into what the experience is like for that person. Free of judgment, free of punitive judgment about their lack of motivation or whatever. It's a person you're speaking to, not a player or an athlete. That for me is the fundamental value that drives motivational interviewing. This is a person I'm speaking to. So having understood their experience, okay, and if you like, that's using a following style, using these empathic statements, which I've seen my kid use. So it is something that I'm passionate about. I honestly believe it's something that we're born with, this capacity to make these statements. And I think it's time to demystify empathy in sport and to really help coaches get on top of the skill, because it's worked wonders elsewhere. Okay, so that's my passion speech over with, Dad. When it comes to the practicalities, okay, I would have thought the most useful second step is to put the guide's hat on and ask this person how they think they could best resolve this issue, whether it's an individual or a group. Free of fear, they might have some good ideas. That's change talk. That will predict better attendance immediately.
Can I just take a step back? Sorry, can I just take a step back to the empathy?
Yeah.
So are you sort of fractionally putting you on the spot here? So let's say somebody turns up, a kid turns up late, and the coach starts to have this brief motivation, MI intervention, if you like. There's an element of role playing here, depending on what the person, I should say, says. But what might an empathy statement? Because you said a statement, not a question. What might an empathy statement sound like? What might that be?
It seems like you're having a little bit of difficulty turning up on time. That's it. Do you notice my voice tone didn't go up at the end? It's not confrontational. I could say, seems like you are having a bit of difficulty turning up on time. Well, it'll have a very different impact because my motive is different. But that is an example. Another would be, so sometimes you're able to do this, and at other times it's harder. The key thing is how the person responds. And to that last statement, they will tell you why it's hard for them to turn up. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't use questions, because the question that's begging to be asked there is, have you got any bright ideas about how you can turn up on time? So I'm not suggesting you just endlessly make these statements.
No.
Neither am I suggesting that you become a skilled motivational interviewer. I mean, that was what Fader and I devoted ourselves to in writing this book. We believe it's within the reach of anyone to have these kind of conversations. That conversation could be extremely brief, it'll be more effective, and it'll improve the relationship that you've got with that kid, with that young person, because of the empathy that you've shown for their experience. And then, if they don't come up with any ideas, the relationship and connection will be solid enough for you to offer some of your own. Okay, and that's what I meant right at the beginning of our discussion, that you can then give this person advice because they'll be receptive to it, because you've bothered to show interest in them as a person and why they've struggled to come in on time. So it's a very brief conversation where the response of the kid is your coach. The kid is your coach in the conversation. Wow, I've said a lot there. I'm sorry if that's a bit of a mouthful, my man.
It's fantastic, and what I took from that is that first response is critical. The first response to the person. So the person says, "Oh, sorry, I'm late, coach. What a nightmare." Rather than that response being, "Well, yeah, you know what the rules are like, etc." and berating or even gently chastising, what you're saying is empathize. Example, and tone of voice can be important here. It seems like you find turning up on time is a challenge. And that is an example of empathy. And the idea there is, in essence, what I'm thinking here is you're turning down the volume of emotion, or you're turning down the volume of potential emotion, negative emotion in this situation. And you're sticking a proverbial arm around the player. And whilst you're not verbalizing it's okay, you're not saying it's fine, it doesn't matter.
No, not at all.
You're as you say, you're empathizing with them. You're stating back to them the situation in a non-judgmental tone.
With a genuine desire to understand. It doesn't mean you agree. Okay, it doesn't mean you agree with them, and having had that experience with them, because motivational interviewing is not a set of techniques you do to or on people, it's an experience you have with them, you'll be in a better position to say to them very clearly afterwards, look, we've tried to discuss some ideas here, and here's hoping that you can get on time in future, but just to let you know that we feel very strongly that people get on time here. Because that's the culture that we work in. So it doesn't stop you being clear and instructional, but that is best done after connecting with the person and giving them a bit of space to solve the problem for themselves. And Dan, I honestly believe this is not incredibly complicated stuff discovered by psychologists like me. I honestly believe, from what I've seen around me, in cricket and football, for example, I know that these are two very British words, soccer and cricket, or soccer and baseball. Quality coaches do this naturally. I've seen them. I've seen very high quality coaches who say, the basis of my work is to put the person first and get the best out of them. Then I get better outcomes. And all we're trying to do is discuss how this can be demystified and very practical, I guess.
What you're doing is you're creating steps. So there's an empathy step, and that's what you're suggesting is that is a first statement, a first response, or first response in the form of a statement. Then what you're saying is that can potentially open up the opportunity to guide. And in that guiding scenario, your first port of call is potentially going to be asking the person, are there things that you feel that you can do to find a solution in this area?
Correct. Because the answer will be change talk. And what we found in analyzing healthcare consultations, mental health consultations, indeed I even had an experience with someone looking at tape recordings of interviews with terror suspects. Okay, what you'll find is that the more change talk you get in a conversation, the better the outcome.
What I'm guessing, and I'm just kind of thinking through in my mind here, where that conversation can go, and it's hypothetical, obviously, because it's a made-up role play, but I would imagine that if you do go into that guiding process, and a player and a person, keep saying player, person, comes up with a certain solution, that actually part of being a coach is to assess confidence and motivation in terms of having the capacity to act out that solution. So if we go back to our example here, and the person says, well, I can go to bed earlier, and I think it could be tempting for a coach at that stage to go, okay, great, right, you've got the solution, you've got to go to bed earlier, set your alarm earlier, off you go. And what I'm guessing, and I'm drawing from my own experiences here, is that potentially actually assessing, helping the person, him or herself, assess their capacity to deliver on that solution. And I think, would you use something like a scaling protocol there? On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you in being able to do this?
Wonderful device. It's a wonderful device to use a scaling technique, okay, because it helps them to reflect about, well, how confident they are, what might improve their confidence, which could be the next question you ask them. I think it's probably important to notice that this is a journey for them. It's not something that can be solved instantly, right? Great, so you think you're going to be on time. It's a journey, and the beauty of sports coaching, which doctors and nurses often don't have, is that you have continuity of relationship. And really the benefit of that conversation isn't in whether they turn up at the next practice. The benefit is probably in the next conversation. Because what I often find coaches and doctors say this all the time, they say it, but they're lying. Okay? They're saying it in order to please me. Now that's exactly where we started with motivational interviewing. It is true that if you speak in an abrasive way to somebody, particularly if they're feeling ambivalent, they will lie. Okay, definitely. Now, here's a challenge. If someone like a kid, an adolescent kid of mine, is lying to me but not to my best friend, what does that say? It says that they trust me less than their best friend. Okay, so whose responsibility is it to repair a relationship that's not strong enough? It's the coach's responsibility. So we can't blame the alcoholic or the sportsman for lying, and let alone label them as liars. What we've got to say is, that's telling us we need to work a little bit harder at developing trust, and then they will lie less. So, it's a journey with an individual player, and coaches, it's why I love working in sport. They have this continuity where they can catch up the next week in a very brief conversation. And I reckon players really appreciate feeling safe and free of fear with a coach. And that helps them to thrive and grow. And this comes down to our basic values. I think that's going to help them more than feeling that they're in a punitive environment in which they get punished. Because I promise you, what I've learned in writing a book for school teachers and working in schools is that punishment doesn't promote behavior change. Because the motivation is coming from outside the person, not inside.
3 words that hit me following what you said there, and a couple of things you said 5 minutes ago. Trust, safe and free. Trust, safe and free. Building that trust through safety, through freedom, whether it's freedom of expression, freedom of language, freedom of behavior. Trust. And something you said 5 minutes ago hit me in terms of a potential barrier in sport, and I suppose actually 2 things here, and I would actually orientate them towards the philosophy of coaching. And that's this, is that you said it's not the player, it's not the performer, it's the person that you're talking to. What I want to put to you. So this is number one. We'll go on to number two in a second. But what I want to put to you, Steve, I just wonder if, again, this socialization. I tend to be using this word more and more now in sport. The socialization in sports coaching tends to be towards player and performer and not person. And until we orientate ourselves more towards the person, let me put that another way. When we orientate ourselves more towards the person, we will become better at using a framework such as this. You said Dr. Jonathan Fader and you, don't expect people to be an expert in MI, but people's capacity to deliver on MI, I think, will increase when they focus on the person and not so much on the player and the performer.
And it can be both. But by focusing on the person, you give them the opportunity to feel safe as human beings, and that promotes creativity. And I saw this on a soccer field on the television the other night. I saw a team playing beautifully. And those three words that you used are a pretty good description of what I saw on the field. So as people, they trusted each other. They felt safe. They felt creative. They felt confident in their abilities as people and as footballers. And so I've seen a trap that coaches fall into, which is assuming that everything is about my sport. And the participants, the players, become locked into a single identity, and they have soccer player on their forehead. And actually that prevents them growing as people. And so helping sports people to develop multiple identities is so useful for the sport itself.
Athletic identity and personality identity comes up frequently on the Sports Psych show. So I very much resonate with what you've just said there. The other coaching philosophical strand that was going through my mind there was this notion of journey and not an instant solution. And I say coaching philosophy because I think in coaching, and I can be, as you were speaking, I was thinking, wow, I can be very guilty of this as a sports psychologist in an eagerness to help.
Yeah.
I can strive to look for the brief therapy, if you like, the instant solution, rather than actually helping a player explore this, a player explore this as a journey, that it's not just about today. And if we go back to our example of the player who was late, the person who was late, then I think again a coach, that insistence comes from, well, it's got to be right today, it's got to be put right tomorrow.
Yeah.
And if that freedom and safety to go, look, you might get this wrong again, or you might be late again. I don't know if wrong is the right word there, but you might be late again. That's okay. That's okay. We're going to work on this together.
Correct.
To help you to help yourself.
Correct. Yeah, correct. So it doesn't mean that you're being permissive in any way. It just means you know what it takes to get good outcomes. And, you don't have to be, this is a provocative thing to say, and maybe I'll throw it out there and for the listeners to think about. You don't have to be warm to be empathic, okay? Empathy is a skill that can be used, and it's not the same thing as warmth. Warmth is a great human quality. I'm not saying you don't need it, but I'm just saying that player who's late, you might not be feeling warm towards them. In fact, you might be feeling really furious. You don't need to be warm to empathize with them. The number one quality in coaches that I think sports people like is authenticity. Somebody who is not pretending to be anything else. So I'm not trying to encourage the idea of, just be warm and fuzzy here. I'm suggesting that empathy is a skill that you can use, and it's very powerful, but it doesn't mean you agree with someone's behavior or that you don't have tight boundaries. You can have tight boundaries, but give someone space to grow within those boundaries, with the power of empathy being a technique that we have discovered to have enormous potential.
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking of the idea of social and task relationships.
Okay?
And the confusion that coaches get into with these kind of conversations, discussions around these kind of frameworks, when they might actually push back and say, well, hang on a minute, I can't have a social relationship with my players, I can't get too close to my players. And what I hear you say is that difference between empathy and warmth. The empathy is reinforcing the task relationship. Yes, it might be feeding a social relationship, and I'm not saying that is wrong or that shouldn't be worked on. But
yes.
if a coach is fearful of this approach making him or her too close to a player, or perceived
Correct.
to be too close to a player,
Correct.
That's not the case.
No.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah. And, there are times when you have to make tough decisions as a coach to leave a player out of a squad. But if you have a good quality relationship where the player feels they're understood and you've expressed empathy to them in the past, they will be stronger inside themselves to cope with the tough decision that you've made.
You said for a player to feel understood. What's your thoughts on a coach saying something like, I understand but I don't approve? So I suppose I'm asking you, can a coach within this framework make a value statement? I understand but I don't approve. Or would you avoid something like that?
No, I think you must be able to make that value statement. But you're looking after usually the needs of a group of people. And there've got to be some kind of norms that govern, like the use of cell phones, in a group of players. And there's a question of who makes that judgment. And I'm suggesting that you're going to get greater adherence to a cell phone policy if the players themselves come up with it than if you do. But you can be very clear about what is acceptable. You do need the norms, but it doesn't stop you believing in their ability to solve problems and in committing to that.
That's very interesting. So I can, as a coach, I can develop a values-driven culture, and actually I can empower my players to create and come up with the values and the subsequent behaviours that perhaps underpin those values. And I can use motivational interviewing as a framework. These can go hand in hand. So once we know our values, once we know our behaviours, actually that can feed change talk.
Correct.
I can empathise, I can guide, but I can still direct a person and a player back to our values and our behaviours to help promote the guidance, I suppose.
Exactly. Yep. Skillful stuff, relationship building and coaching, eh?
And final few minutes here, because I want to dwell on what you've just said. Skillful stuff, building relationships. And Steve, again, one of my other missions, and I suppose the overarching mission with relation to what I said earlier about the mission of helping coaches understand that anxiety, I suppose suboptimal well-being and welfare happens to you. It's not a choice, essentially. In line with that is I'm passionate about coaches putting the psychosocial, the psychosocial components first. That I'm not saying they're more important than the technical, tactical and physical, but they are just as complex and they are just as complicated. And I think, again, in sport, socialised, very socialised into X's and O's. And I'm on a mission to perhaps push coaches a bit more towards, come on, let's be much more appreciative of the complexity and the complication around the psychosocial factors component, such as, and this is only one example, building relationships. Helping players and people find solutions. It's complicated and complex, isn't it?
It is, and one comfort I can offer you is that if you need to have the humility to let the player be your teacher about what works, because each player is different, and in their reaction to how you speak to them, to what you speak about, in their reaction is your guidance about what to do next. And so the complexity in a way can not disappear, but a path through it can be forged by your being humble enough to be tuned into what's going to work for this person. And conversation skills are one of the keys to that.
And as you're speaking there, I'm thinking about listening skills, which I know are central to motivational interviewing, and I think I'm very sensitive to your time, Steve. And
don't worry, I'm a happy one.
You've been very, very generous with your time. So what I'm excited about is bringing Dr. Jonathan Fader into the conversation as well next week, and we'll certainly be talking more about those listening skills. But thank you so much for your time and your contribution here. I know you're based at Cardiff University, and I know you're doing a lot more in sport now, which is really exciting for us who are involved in the sports industry. You will have tapped the interest of so many of the listeners of the Sports Psych Show. How can people find you, and if it's okay with you, how can people get in contact with you?
I've got a website. I suppose if you put my name into Google, you'll catch it. But it's stephenrollnick.com. And there's a whole lot of other stuff there connected to mental health and stuff. But your listeners need to know that sport is my main passion. And so I really hope I have the time. I'll certainly have the motivation to respond to them as they put inquiries through the website.
Fantastic. And the book is out soon?
The book's out in the US and out in the UK second week of January.
Fantastic. Now, what I do want to, before you go, want to say to our listeners is that they can actually get a discount on the book. So they can get a 25% discount on the book if they go to guilford.com, and that's spelled GUILFORD.com/P/Rollnick3, which is spelled ROLLNICK 3, and they type in AFSPO, AFSPO at checkout. You will get a 25% discount. I will put that in the show notes. Professor, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Cheers, Dan. Be well yourself, eh?
Thank you very much, sir. Well, everybody, what a fantastic conversation that was. I really enjoyed speaking to Professor Steve Rollnick, and I hope you enjoyed that conversation as well. Please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me exactly what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.